Hi, welcome to the Praise of Folly podcast, Lyceum Debates. I'm Logos or Mediator, as my YouTube handle is called. I'll be moderating this debate. The proposition in question is in defense of empire. Todd will be defending the proposition. Keith Preston will be opposing the proposition. The first introduction will be 10 minutes, and Todd has first introduction, and he can begin when ready.
Okay. Thank you, Logos. I will begin by reading a letter sent by the African King Bell and King Aqua of the Cameroon River. Dear W. Gladstone, we both, your servants, have met this afternoon to write you these few lines of writing, trusting it may find you in a good state of life as it leaves us at the present. As we have heard there, you are the chief of man in the House of Commons, so we write to tell you that we want to be under Her Majesty's control. We want our country to be governed by the British government. We are tired of governing this country ourselves. Every dispute leads to war and often to great loss of lives. So we think it is the best thing to give up this country to the British men, who no doubt will bring peace, civilization, and Christianity in this country. Do for mercy's sake, please, lay our request before the Queen and to the rulers of the British government. Do, sir, for mercy's sake, please to assist us in this important undertaking. We have heard that you are a good Christian man, so we hope that you will do all you can in your power to see that our request is granted. We are quite willing to abolish all our heathen customs. No doubt God will bless you for putting a light in our country. Please to send us and answer as quickly as you can. Now, later, the British would later refuse to do this because they believed that it was not in their interest to exercise control over the Cameroon. But this does open up with what empire produces, and the lack of empire does not: security. So before we go on to the arguments for empire, it behooves us to define what an empire is. I will define an empire as a multi-ethnic, hegemonic security commons. It is multi-ethnic in that there is often more than one ethnic group within the empire, even if one ethnic group is in charge. It is hegemonic in that it has control over an area that is larger than, quote, a nation state, but smaller than a one world government. And it creates a security commons by creating security and order within a given region. Now, there are three services that the empire can provide. It provides order, it facilitates trade, and it provides civilization. So if you look at the great empires throughout history, there are four periods especially that highlight the importance of the order an empire produces. China, from around the early 8th century to the early 3rd century, was in a period of civil war called they were in a period of civil war. And during that period, the Zhou dynasty was in tremendous withdrawal, and feuding princes beneath the empire were rising up to challenge it. And eventually one would then unite China under the first emperor. During this 500-year period of civil war, culminating in the last 200 years, tremendous bloodshed occurred, order dissolved away, and China was living in turmoil and chaos. When the Western Roman Empire collapses in the 5th century, we see a similar trend. Massive depopulation, order evaporates, barbarian tribes come in and loot and plunder and pillage, and all that vestige of civilization evaporates away. Now, in the Middle East, in the Islamic era, there's been three great hegemonic powers. There's been the Umayyad Caliphate, the Abbasid Caliphate, and the Ottoman Empire. Now, what we see in the Middle East is that when there's a power vacuum of empires, there tends to be unending civil war. So at the beginning of the decline of the Abbasid Caliphate, sometime around the 9th century, and the consolidation of the Ottoman Empire sometime in the 16th century, we see a period of unending civil war and invasion, first beginning with Arab princes and dukes and whatnot competing over the carcass of the Abbasid Empire, then invasion from the east of Turks and Mongols, culminating in the decisive destruction of Baghdad, which set civilization back in the Middle East almost irreversibly, and from the west, the crusading forces. And so the Middle East was one giant boiling battleground of turmoil, and the Ottoman Empire brought relative peace. Once the Ottoman Empire dissolved, the Middle East returned into its infighting, and now we have no peace. The Iran-Iraq War, the Arab-Israeli Wars, terrorism, the Syrian Civil War. None of this was going on when the Ottomans were in charge. The fourth example would be at the end of World War I. You had the great empires of Russia, Germany, and Austria. Prior to their consolidation, sometime in the early 19th century, there was tremendous violence and friction along these imperial borders, leading to unending conquest and bloodshed. After those empires were dissolved, Europe falls into a century of chaos. World War II, the Soviet occupation of Eastern Europe, and now we see continuing turmoil in the Ukraine. So these empires, for good or ill, provided something that no other political order could provide in those regions throughout the historical record of those regions: security. Now, security is only a means to an end. Another thing that the empire provides is international commerce. So we can look at the Silk Road. There are 3 periods of history that speak to the Silk Road when it was open for trade. The 1st century AD, when the Roman Empire, the Parthian Empire, the Kushans, and the Han Chinese kept the trade routes open. And as each empire began to collapse, the security on the trade routes declined. Therefore, trade tended to dry up. And then you had in the 8th century, the Abbasid Caliphate in the west and the Tang Chinese in the east. They were also able to maintain the trade route, and civilization flourished, commerce flourished, cities were built, and philosophy and culture developed along the route. Then when they too collapsed. And the final grand gesture of the Silk Road was under the Pax Mongolica under Genghis Khan and his successors. The Silk Road finally dried up entirely once the Europeans found a way around the great land routes of Asia by sea to Africa and then to the New World itself. Now we also see in the Mediterranean, trade would flourish under the aegis of Minoan hegemony, Athenian hegemony, and Roman hegemony. And when those empires collapsed, trade would dry up, pirates would spring up. And famously, Caesar was kidnapped by pirates when in the war that Pompey waged against them. And once the Romans banished the pirates, trade flourished. Then you see, with the collapse of the Western Roman Empire, the Vandals, the rise of the Arabs, piracy returns. The Mediterranean becomes inhospitable for trade and commerce, and cities and civilizations wither and die. Then you have the Italian city-states, which for a brief time restore the peace, and then they decline. And then the pirates rise up again in the Barbary states. Not until the French conquest of Algeria and Tunisia are these forces finally dealt with. And then international trade, beginning with the Dutch and then later the British and Americans, can only occur within the safety of the security commons provided by their navies. So the Great Britain, firstly, cleared out all the pirates, and the other hostile nations with fleets were not necessarily defeated and annihilated, since the French and the Japanese and the Americans still had ships, but the lion's share of the policing of world trade routes was done by the British, and a sort of international consensus was developed. Now, what called LEO, the Liberal International Economic Order. And then when the British Empire stumbled and fell in World War II, the United States picked up the mantle. And under this, say, past 200-year period of Anglo dominance, trade has flourished, scientific development has flourished, human civilization has flourished, cities have grown, populations have grown. And without these empires present, none of this would have happened. We would still be stuck in the internecine struggles that beset the Middle East and Dark Age Europe. And lastly, the empires provide civilization. They improve manners, morals, and material conditions. Prior to the Europeans showing up, North America, South America, and Sub-Saharan Africa were essentially Stone Age civilizations with extremely barbaric practices. So, first of all, there was cannibalism in the New World. There was human sacrifice throughout the New World and Sub-Saharan Africa. Women were treated as chattel. Slavery was rampant. And the European empires ended these practices over a period of years. And the British, culminating in the 19th century, ended all human trafficking more or less around the world and outlawed slavery. Second of all, they brought a great level of material benefit: universities, hospitals, modern science, roads, medicine. And for all the whining and moaning of the imperial subjects having thrown off the yoke of these powers, very few of them would wish to reject the fruits of those empires. And would they really have go back in time to rewrite history to make sure the British didn't come and outlaw slavery and human sacrifice and give them universities and hospitals? I somehow doubt it. And so in conclusion, the empire is the best system that man has yet devised to provide these 3 services: order, commerce, and civilization. I yield the rest of my time.
All right, thank you. Keith, you may start when ready.
Okay. Well, I think that probably the best way to make an argument against the concept of empire is to address the arguments that are typically used for an empire. So I'm going to go through some of the standard arguments and point out what I think some of the problems are. One is that empires have the effect of developing international peace, that a single hegemonic power promotes international peace. This is the kind of argument that Hobbes made in Leviathan, or at least it's an extension of that argument. And historical examples will be those like Pax Romana during the Roman period, or many have argued for a Pax Americana in the contemporary world. There's a present-day diplomat, a fellow by the name of James Dobbins, who has made this argument. He has said, well, would we really want to have a contemporary world order where, say, the Germans are a superpower with nuclear weapons in Europe, or where the Japanese are still a superpower with nuclear weapons in Asia? And this is there are variations of this argument, but this is the standard argument and the examples that are typically provided. Other arguments or other examples are some of the same ones that Todd pointed out, like the Ottoman Empire and the British Empire and others. There's a number of problems with this argument. One is that we could use an analogy to the mafia. If a mafia organization or a street gang achieves a monopoly over other mafia entities or other gangs, it may be true that wars between mafia organizations may diminish, but all it really means is that one criminal organization has gotten the upper hand over its rivals. That doesn't necessarily justify the criminal organization itself. It's also true that empires and imperialism cost a great deal in blood and treasure to the empire builders, and that empires usually come to a very bad end. All of these great empires from world history, whether it's the Romans, the British, the Ottomans, or whomever, where are they today? Well, the answer is they're nowhere. And the reason for that is that empires tend to self-destruct. They tend to engage in overextension. They tend to bankrupt themselves. They tend to cost a lot to their own subjects in terms of wealth, in terms of death and war and aggression. And they're also very costly to their subjects as well. They may bring certain benefits to their subjects, but they also impose a great deal of cost on their subjects. There's also the question of the excessive concentration of power and tyranny. Do we really want to have power concentrated in a single hegemon? If we don't want power concentrated in a single dictator in a nation, then why would we want to have world power concentrated into a single state? So the same principle applies there. All we really have to do is look at the contemporary United States, and we see that the United States is a nation constantly at war. It's becoming one of the world's most hated nations, at least in terms of international relations. The United States empire is presently engaged in self-bankruptcy through excessive military spending, and has also generated a serious problem as far as terrorist blowback as well, with 9/11 being the most serious example. So their empire has its cost. The supposed peace that is imposed by empire is really not all that peaceful when you look at the big picture. Another argument is the argument from economic development. It will typically be argued, and Neil Ferguson, who was a contemporary British writer that has argued in favor of a 21st century American empire similar to the 19th century British Empire. Neil Ferguson makes this argument. The argument is that empires facilitate economic development by establishing a large free trade area, and through policing trade routes, by keeping sea lanes open, by breaking down barriers between nations, and essentially forcing trade to happen. Now, the first problem I would have with this is that it's kind of like arguing that crime is good because it provides an economic stimulus. And that's essentially what this argument amounts to. It amounts to the claim that military aggression against other societies, conquest, subjugation, ultimately has a positive effect because it imposes trade and commerce on all of these different societies and breaks down tariff walls and forces markets to be open. This is a policy that the United States, throughout much of its history, pursued in Asia, known as the open door policy. If we want to make the argument that aggression of this type facilitates economic development, I think we could make a similar argument concerning crime. We could say crime is good because It creates jobs for police officers and prison guards and lawyers and judges and prosecutors and security companies and manufacturers of handcuffs and firearms and things like that. But at what cost? The question is, what cost? Did the cost outweigh the benefits? And it's certainly not clear that the cost or that the benefits outweigh the cost when it comes to the economic development question. Parallel to this is the issue of scientific and technological investment development. It's been argued that the accumulation of wealth for the development of expensive projects, like say the Roman road system, which was very sophisticated for its time, or the Babylonian and Assyrian and Egyptian aqueducts, which were a fairly significant development technologically for their time, as well as more contemporary things like NASA, the American space program, or parallel to that, the Soviet space program. It can be argued that centralization of wealth and control over vast amounts of resources is allegedly necessary for such projects. A rebuttal to that might be that the wealth that is utilized for these kinds of purposes has to be taken from elsewhere and not used for other purposes. It assumes that the use of this wealth acquired by empire has no cost, and that such wealth would have not been used for other purposes, perhaps better purposes. And much of the technological development that is done by empires is done for the purpose of developing weapons and developing more efficient methods of war and conquest. So again, it comes down to the issue of cost-benefit analysis. What do we really get out of all of this? Cultural development is another issue. It can be argued that empires facilitate cultural development. One example might be Alexander the Great's spread of Hellenistic culture throughout the Near East, the ancient Near East, or the comparatively high culture that the Roman Empire developed. Or another argument might be the Napoleonic Wars and Napoleon's efforts to spread the culture of the Enlightenment throughout Europe. I think that a problem with that argument is that imperialists are usually piggybacking on the cultural development that came before them. Alexander the Great and then later the Romans were largely piggybacking on the actual culture that had been created by the ancient Greek civilization. It's not certain that they actually added anything to that cultural development. And the same is true of Napoleon. It could be argued that Napoleon and his efforts were actually a regression, that the achievements of the Enlightenment and the French Revolution had actually been reversed in large part because of his influence. There's also the question of cultural preservation. Empires have the impact of eliminating distinct regional and local cultures and producing cultural homogenization. It's also been argued that empires can facilitate cosmopolitanism, that multinational empires are good because they can facilitate interaction between ethnic groups and produce a kind of harmony between different communities. Examples that have been given there are Austria-Hungary is one, the Ottomans are another. However, it's also true that multicultural empires in the long run usually collapse due in part to ethnic conflict. Rome's barbarian invasion was one of those. The Ottomans eventually engaged in full-scale genocide of the Armenians. And what was the fate of Austria-Hungary? They lasted for about 50 years and then collapsed due in part to ethnic conflict, which in turn became the foundation for many of the ethnic wars of the latter part of the 20th century in Central Europe. Empires subjugate their colonized people. They maintain control by playing off different groups against each other. This in turn leads to greater conflict in the long run. A good example is what happened in Rwanda and the legacy of Belgian colonialism there. Whole races and ethnic groups were destroyed or dispersed during the European colonialism era. For example, the Tasmanian people essentially went extinct because of that. And there's also the fact that if colonialism is so wonderful for its subjects, why have we had so many anti-colonial wars during the second half of the 20th century? There's also the claim that empires advance civilizations, that it brings civilization to backward peoples, like banning the Seti in India, or ending human sacrifice among the Aztecs, or bringing European civilization to Africa. This is the so-called white man's burden, or at least that's what it was once called. It's not certain that you're civilizing people by killing them. Again, the indigenous population of Tasmania was nearly wiped out due to British imperialism. There's also the transatlantic slave trade. That was certainly an important legacy of European colonialism, and it's not quite certain that that was involved advancing civilization.
Time.
Okay,
Sorry.
go ahead. Sure.
All right, Todd, your first rebuttal can start when you're ready.
Okay. So there's a lot to pick through here. So I'll look at a couple points here that Keith brought up. One of them seemed to be the broken window fallacy. That, I mean, right, if the empire is going to be conquering people and breaking things, and then spending money on the military, is that really the most efficient spending of those resources? Well, part, and this is also tied into the argument about civilizing people, because again, it takes effort, cost, and time and money to subjugate people to civilize them. Well, see, that's assuming that people would ever, on their own initiative, get to that level of civilization. The New World, for better part of 4,000 years, gave no indication they were even close to that. The Germanic peoples north of the Rhine, prior to the conversion to Christianity, gave no hint that they were ever going to do this unless someone conquered them and restructured their society. And as far as is it a good investment? Well, I mean, again, I would say compared to what? Because if you don't do this, we can look at, say, the Greek city-states or the Dark Age European principalities. You're engaging in unending internecine warfare with your neighbors. You're open to invasion by larger powers, like in the case of medieval Europe, the Magyars and the Mongols. In the case of the Middle East, the Turks and the Mongols. In the case of India, the Scythians and the Chinese, a whole host of nomadic barbarian tribes that invaded and subjugated these peoples. And I would argue that the cost of maintaining the empire, so like, for instance, the Roman legions on the Rhine. Once the Roman Empire totally collapsed and the world, the Western Europe went into basically a cesspit, I don't think anybody would say in hindsight, oh, yeah, the legions were not worth the cost, because the cost of not having the legions was losing everything. And so I think that the cost can be justified in the sense that without it, you would just be overcome by these barbarian forces or your neighbors in internecine warfare. Whereas at least on the south of the Rhine and the south of the Danube, Rome had the Pax Romana, Pax. Now, as far as the trade objection, I'm not entirely sure what Keith was getting at, but one possible interpretation is that not all empires are equally conducive to trade. So, for example, one might argue that, say, the Romans were more conducive to mercantile activity than, say, the Chinese. And I would say that, well, yeah, that may be true, though it's not so much this or that particular empire itself, but that the preconditions for international commerce come with an empire. It's a necessary but not a sufficient condition for, say, what Deepak Lawless called LEO, the liberal international economic order. So there's this element that, yeah, it's expensive, but again, if you don't have it, you don't have an international commercial order, which means we're all basically, eating canned beans, in some sort of, squatting on some sort of strip mall, shivering in bearskins, because the global economy collapsed and gangbangers and invading armies have taken over. Now, the other thing is the objection that the imperialist powers are piggybacking on a culture. I don't know too many people that would argue that the empire itself creates culture. It's that the empire projects a superior culture. And again, I think the New World and the Germanic tribes north of the Rhine are a clear example. They gave us no indication over the millennia they were existing that they were ever going to get out of this slump of underdevelopment, this sort of civilizational funk, if you will. And so by doing this, we're able to do that as well. And the key thing to understand here is that the sort of area of safety, prosperity, and security necessary to create these kinds of institutions and cultural norms that we are accustomed to can really only happen once the frontier of violence has been pushed sufficiently far away from the center that we can do that. And that's what the proverbial legions are there for, to push the frontiers of violence far enough away from the interior that they can develop in peace and security and build up a system of culture, technology, civilization, and commerce. I yield the rest of the time.
Okay, Keith, you can start your rebuttal when ready.
Well, as far as the arguments that were previously raised, I think the first one that I find very problematic is the argument that, well, if it had not have been for the colonialists or imperialists or the empire builders or whatever, that all of these supposedly backward and uncivilized people would have been stuck in time for perpetuity and never engaged in any kind of cultural development of their own. That has not been demonstrated as to be something that can be a factual claim. It's merely speculation. We don't know what would have happened to India or Africa or the Native American peoples or the people of South America or whomever. We don't know what would have happened to any of these people if they had not been subject to colonial conquest and subjugation. We see that on one hand, many of these societies were very underdeveloped compared to, say, the Europeans, before the era of colonialism and imperialism. But we also see that many of them have also had some very serious problems as a result of colonialism and imperialism. How well have the African nations fared in the post-colonial era? It's only been since the Africans have shaken off colonialism, and only since the Africans have now had a good number of a good amount of time as independent nations, that they've really started to develop. In the last 20 years or so, we've started to see the African nations develop, in part due to the economic relationship they've developed with the Chinese. But the Chinese relationship with Africa is different than the traditional European colonial relationship with Africa, in the sense that the Chinese are much more in favor of recognizing the sovereignty of the individual African nations and setting up more equitable trade arrangements. It's not this kind of system of cultural domination and economic domination that we saw imposed on Africa by the Europeans. So I think that's an important distinction. And it's only been during this time that Africa has finally achieved a lengthy period of independence and engaged in the development of trade relationships with external powers of its own, that we've started to see development in Africa, like parts of Africa, for example, where the average annual income has actually increased about 20 times during the last 20 years or so, from, say, about $300 a year up to about $5,000 a year. We're starting to see the development of commercial societies in the middle class and things like that in some of the African nations, including nations that were very far behind only a short time ago, like Angola and some of these others. So I think that's one thing that has to be considered. The same is true of India. The legacy of British imperialism in India was what? What did Britain actually bring to India? When India achieved its independence in 1947, was India that much more developed of a society than it was when the British came? I'm not sure that they were. Development in India has in many ways paralleled what has happened in Africa, in that since India has become independent, since India has been able to practice self-determination and develop its own trade relationships with other parts of the world, with Russia, with China, with America and others, it's only then that we've actually seen economic development of any serious kind take place in India, and the urbanization and modernization of Indian cities and things of that nature. So yes, it's true that many of these societies were in bad shape before the colonialists came, but they were in bad shape when the colonialists left. Also, it should be pointed out that at present, there are about 100 uncontacted people that remain today in different parts of the world. These are people that largely have been uncontacted, about 100 ethnic groups that have largely not been exposed to external ethnic groups. And the question remains is, why is that wrong? Why should any other external power go and impose their own cultural norms or their own economic norms on any of these peoples? And would that be for the benefit of these peoples? I gave the example earlier of the Tasmanians. The Tasmanians were nearly wiped out by British imperialism. The same thing happened to the native peoples of North America. They were nearly wiped out by English imperialism. Where are the Native American people of North America today? How have they really benefited from Western imperialism, other than to see their population numbers diminish considerably? They are one of the smallest ethnic groups in the North American continent today, largely because so many of them died as a direct effect of Western imperialism. And they're among the poorest and most disadvantaged ethnic groups in the North American continent at present. So it's not clear that that imperialism has been any kind
time.
of... Sure.
Okay, cross-examinations. There'll be 10 minutes per person. Todd, you can begin when ready.
All right, thank you. Okay, so Keith Preston, you mentioned that both Africa and India have developed more economically with the withdrawal of the European empires, which is true. But wouldn't you say that that's the result of the liberal international economic order maintained by the United States throughout the post-war era, which would imply the support for the broader claim that the kinds of economic development that is taking place can only take place within the penumbra of some kind of empire?
Well, no. I mean, first of all, the international economic order was not developed by the United States. This is something the international liberal, quote unquote, economic order has its roots. Essentially, it goes back to maybe the late Middle Ages, the early Renaissance period, and the American dominance within the international order is only the latest manifestation of that. But the idea that there needs to be some kind of imperial hegemon that is somehow going to facilitate economic development on an international level seems to be a fairly dubious claim. It's certainly possible for nations, communities, tribes, regions, organizations, businesses, all of these other kinds of entities to engage in trade and exchange and mutual economic cooperation with each other without some single imperial entity telling them, no, you must trade with each other. Genuine economic development and progress comes about when people engage in mutual cooperation and for the purpose of meeting their common economic needs through trade and through methods that are peaceful, not through methods that involve conquest. Imperialism and colonialism are ultimately about conquest. They are about subjugating other people and forcing the economic and political and cultural values of one group on others. Again, I think that the analogy to crime applies. If imperialism is good because it generates economic benefits, then we could say the same thing about crime. We could say that crime is great, that when someone engages in armed robbery, that may look like they're doing an injustice or whatever to the victim of an armed robbery, but ultimately a good thing is happening because they take the proceeds from the armed robbery and they put it back into the economy by buying stuff at the store, and that stimulates the economy, and plus it creates jobs for the security industry and law enforcement and all of that. I mean, you could make an argument like that if you wanted to. But the question is, well, does that really produce a happy society in terms of the big picture? And I'm not convinced that it does. Again,
let me step in here. It's not that I argued the United States began the international order. It's just that at the current iteration, the United States Navy is the key element making that possible. I think there's a bit of a confusion here. It's not that I'm saying the fact that the empire has navies, has armies, has an air force, that they're being paid for, that act itself is the cause of the prosperity. But it creates the system in which trade can occur. So again, the Silk Road trade dried up when one or more of the empires collapsed because there wasn't a hegemon to guarantee the security of the merchant. You're not going to travel 6,000 miles from Xi'an to Antioch twice, so 12,000 miles total round trip without being sure you could deliver your goods or to then return with the proceeds of your trip. And we don't see any other historical examples of those kinds of commons, security commons, being created any other way. And we might argue, well, okay, is the cost of the legions too high? Well, I think most people would agree that the cost of the legions are worth bearing for the very fact that they pay the taxes necessary for the legions, that they don't overthrow the government that has the legions, and that they are more than happy to consume the produce of the trade that it takes place under the watchful eye of the legions. So I don't really see any sort of historical counterpart to provide the kinds of things that both you and I would like to see provided. So well, I guess, yeah, go ahead.
I think the question is whether or not this kind of imperial hegemon is necessary for the development of trade in the first place, and whether we can even say that such a situation constitutes free trade in any honest sense. A good example, again, would be the one that I mentioned earlier, the open door policy of the United States in Asia. The United States policy in Asia in the 19th century was simply to invade and conquer. The United States went out and started to annex territories in the Pacific, like Hawaii and the Philippines and others. And then that led to the invasions, or essentially the attempted imperial subjugation of Asian nations. There was the forcing Japan to open their trade routes and things like that. But the question is whether or not this ultimately produces beneficial effects for any of the parties that are involved. Maybe they do on some peripheral level, but at what cost? I think that the cost of these things are really not considered. What actually caused economic development to happen in Japan, and ultimately was when Japanese leadership looked at the Western world and they saw that the Western world was more advanced than they were in terms of their technology and education and things like that. And they decided that that's what they wanted to emulate. They wanted to emulate what they saw happening in the West because they thought they would have a better society. So ultimately, Western influence came to Japan through example, not through military conquest. And we can contrast that with China. China has always been a very xenophobic society, and that was certainly true when Western merchants started coming to China in the 19th century. And part of the policy there was that the Chinese would actually require the ships to dock at that port, and the merchants could come off the ships into the ports just to do business, but they couldn't venture into China. That's how afraid they were of cultural contamination and things like that. But because of this, because of the kind of level of xenophobia that China had at the time, that they remained a very closed society, and they tended to stagnate quite a bit. They were a very backward society in the early 20th century compared to the Japanese. So it was ultimately the Western influence, the leading by example, that helped the Japanese to develop into a kind of Western industrial society.
I wouldn't necessarily disagree with that, because with empires, there's more than one way to enforce the security hegemon. So, for example, like China today in Africa, the United States today doesn't invade African nations like, say, Britain or France or Brazil, Belgium did. But we also improve trade that way too. But again, when you point to Africa, to India, not so much Japan, those nations did adopt the liberal property law-abiding reforms that allowed for economic development at home because of the influence of the British and French colonial powers that were already there. Now, but this gets to the more broad picture here, is that international trade routes cannot be secure. There is no historical example of international trade routes, either be it on land or on sea, being protected or provided for without a hegemon or a concert of hegemons that protect the trade. So the argument for imperial economic prosperity is not that spending money on armies and navies is what makes you rich, or that the cost of war to conquer somebody is what makes you rich. It's that by ensuring that pirates and rogue nations can't interdict other people's trade. So, for example, under the Leo that we have today, if China wants to trade with Kenya, it's going to be very difficult for, say, Saudi Arabia and other Arabian states to engage in piracy against that. That's the threat that's being combated against. Or if you had a nation like India that became a rogue state and just decided to plunder the trade routes. And we've seen this historically with people like the Vikings, people like the privateers, like the French and the Americans in the 18th century. So the idea that even a nation might resort to piracy to plunder trade routes and interdict trade is one thing we've seen again and again. And I just don't see any alternative that's been produced historically to ensure the open passage of goods throughout the world.
Well, I think that argument rests on the assumption that the facilitation of trade is the highest of all values. And I'm not sure that that's a point of view that can be rationally defended either. There are a lot of contemporary economists who seem to make that argument that it's called economism, the idea that, well, if something makes money or facilitates economic growth, then it's by definition good and desirable. I don't think that's the case at all. I think that economic development and growth can certainly be good, but not at all costs, and not without
time. I'm just going to point out that we're switching to the next round, so we can just pick up this thought and note that it's Keith's turn to cross-examine.
Okay. Well, the first question that I would have for anyone who wanted to be a defender of imperialism or empire building is, what about the actual cost of empires? And I think the first cost is not necessarily the money that's spent on weapons and armaments and things like that. The actual cost is in blood. Has there been one empire historically that was not based upon blood and conquest and domination? Now, the argument that some imperialists have made historically, for example, the Romans would be a good example. Their outlook was simply, we conquer because we can. It's something that we can do, and that's what we do. Nazi Germany was another example. For them, they had an ideology that essentially said war and conquest are good. They're values unto themselves. Okay, I suppose on a certain primitive level, I can respect that. But the argument that imperialism, colonialism, empire building, conquest, that these things somehow benefit civilization, that they facilitate the growth of culture and human progress and things like that, that's a point of view that I find extremely dubious. What exactly would justify the cost of the extinction of the Tasmanian people? What would justify the cost of the dwindling of the population of the Native Americans from about 10 million when the British came to being just a tiny percentage of the American population today? What would justify the cost of the slaughter of the indigenous people of the Americas? What would justify the cost of the genocide in the Congo during Belgian colonialism under King Leopold? What would justify the building of concentration camps by the German imperialists in Africa, like at Shark Island? I don't know of anything that would really justify this. I mean, unless you're going to make an argument like the Romans might have made, like the National Socialist Germany might have made, where conquest and subjugation are ends unto themselves. Again, I suppose that's one way of looking at it. But as far as how this facilitates civilization and human development, I don't really see it.
Okay, well, if that's the question, the question is, what is the cost of empire worth bearing? Well, I would argue that what is the cost of not having an empire worth bearing? Because without an empire to provide security, the Viking raids and predatory activity drove the inhabitants of the Hebrides Islands to extinction. Numerous nomadic raiders from the steppe over a 2,500-year period killed, if not tens of millions, hundreds of millions of people when the Mongols laid waste to vast swaths of the Near East and China and Eastern Europe because they were disunited. They were not able to defend themselves. You had the barbarian invasions of Western Europe, which led to a depopulation scarcely matched in history. The city of Rome at its peak had maybe 1 million people living in it, possibly as late as the 4th century. But by the beginning of the 6th century, what we have is a population of only 40,000. That is a massive depopulation. Cities that the Romans built that were in the tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands just disappeared in the blink of the historic eye due to these barbarian invaders because the legions failed in their primary duty. Now, we can also look at the cost of civil war in the Middle East. In the absence of the uniting force of the Abbasid Caliphate, we have 600 years or 700 years of internecine warfare that led to the destruction of Arab civilization, culminating with the Mongol sack of Baghdad. And then with the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, we've had numerous infighting. And while Keith mentions the genocide of the Kurds, the genocide of the Armenians, Saddam Hussein has been engaged in the genocide of the Kurds. And one could even argue the Shiite majority when he was in charge. The Iranians as well, the Iran-Iraq war led to the deaths of 1 million men. We have the current civil war in Syria and Iraq and Egypt. Well, Egypt's more of a dictatorship now. And then the many Arab-Israeli wars. Now, if I were to wager that if we were to look at the eras of peace under the Umayyads, Abbasids, and Ottoman empires, and the amount of bloodshed that it took to maintain those empires, we would see that fewer people would have died than would have died in the absence of those empires. And the same can be said on the Eurasian landmass in China, India, and Europe due to the nomadic conquerors. And Western Europe due to the Germanic and Viking conquerors. If we add up all of those death tolls and compare them to the death tolls of the empires that drove them out and ultimately conquered them, like the Russians and the Chinese, not only do we have a lower death toll, I would argue, but we actually have civilization. We have cities and universities and hospitals and the flowering of arts and sciences, which these raiders do not produce, which these civil wars do not produce. They're not produced under any other circumstances, unless that you might point to a small group of people that are able to do that without an empire. So, for example, United States prior to the Spanish-American War, the Greek city-states. But that's almost always the case because they're free riding on a larger empire. In the case of the Greek city-states, they were free riding on the security brought by Persia. In the case of the United States, they were free riding on the security brought by the British. In fact, the American plan to keep the Europeans out of North America could only happen because the Royal Navy was there to back it up. The Monroe Doctrine had no teeth without the British. So I would argue that while the cost of empires varying from empire to empire are high, the cost of not having an empire is even higher for those that have to live under either civil war between brothers or foreign invasion and aggression from barbarians and other empires. So do you have any more questions, Keith, or do you want to ask?
Well, I'm a bit confused about the example of the Mongols, because it seems like to me if you argue that empire building is in itself a good thing, and if you argue that, and you can see that, well, empire building inevitably involves conquest and subjugation, was that not exactly what the Mongols were doing or attempting to do? I don't really see what the argument against the Mongols would be if you ultimately start with the presumption that imperialism and conquest are desirable ends because of their supposed benefits in terms of imposition of order by means of a single hegemon or civilizational development or opening trade routes. That it seems to me that's exactly what the Mongols were trying to do, perhaps unsuccessfully. But let's suppose that the Mongols had been more successful over a long period of time, and perhaps a Mongol empire had developed for a long period of time in Asia. Why would that have been problematic? What exactly would have been wrong with the Mongols? The same could be said of the Vikings. I mean, the Vikings, the only real, if you start with the presumption that empire building is good, the only real objection to the Vikings is that they just weren't very good at it. They weren't very good at building a Viking empire, and ultimately they lost out to rival forces. As far as the issue with the Middle East, as far as the contemporary Middle East, many of the wars that have happened in the contemporary Middle East are the direct result of earlier forms of colonialism and imperialism, where after the Ottoman Empire was defeated, it was carved up by the European empires, mostly the British, and they created all of these unnatural boundaries where you have people living under the same political roof that have nothing in common with each other, and that ultimately creates these internecine power struggles that we've seen played out in so many of those countries, virtually all of them. As for the Greek cities, I'm not quite sure how the Persians created a kind of international order that allowed the Greek city-states to thrive. If anything, the Persians actually tried to conquer and subjugate the Greek city-states, and unsuccessfully. But I don't really see any of these as being examples of how civilization was advanced or managed to flourish because of imperialism.
Well, in the time that we have left, let me answer the first question. Vis-a-vis the Mongols in Baghdad, the argument is not that the Mongols were bad because they conquered Baghdad. It's that it was bad for the Middle East to be so disunited because of the collapse of the Abbasid Caliphate that it left it vulnerable to that. Now, you also mentioned with the Vikings, that means they were just bad empire builders. And to some extent, that would be the objection. But then again, they never really intended to build an empire. They were more like, they had the organizational level of biker gangs. Whereas, you might say the Mongols had the organizational level of the Cosa Nostra or the Russian mob. Far more cohesive. But even they, of course, were somewhat transient. The Pax Mongolica only lasted maybe a century. So, again, it's not so much that the Mongols are at fault for that. It's just that it's bad for the Middle East to be weak and divided because it leaves it open.
Time. At this point, we're now going to head into our 5-minute closing remarks. Todd, you may go first when ready.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for hosting, Logos, and thank you for joining, Keith. But I will reiterate that the three elements that the three services that the empire provides, which so far I've seen no viable alternative to, is order. The empire provides order, security commons, as we saw with the Silk Road in the 1st century, the 9th century, and the 13th century, within land masses itself, like the Pax Mongolica, the Roman Empire, and then international trade on the high seas with the British and American empires. And as a corollary, they also lead to improved commercial benefits. And these improved commercial benefits can then be led to being plowed back into other parts of society, allowing for population growth, which in turn allows for further development of human capital and arts and literature and the sciences. Whereas, what are the alternatives historically to this? Well, the historical alternatives are the Vikings, the Mongols, the Arabs, these sort of predatory migrant barbarian forces, which never really do anything. They don't build cities, they don't build universities, they don't have reading or writing or scholarship. They just burn everything to the ground. They really are just pure looters. That they move in, they see basically a tent being raised on the steppe, becoming a new city. They just swoop in, level it to the ground, and move on somewhere else. They don't leave anything behind. Whereas with the Romans or the British or the Achaemenids or the Ottomans, once they create this space of security, they allow for the great flourishing of civilizations. So, for example, with the Romans, you've got Rome and the great intellectual center of the world, Alexandria, which was unrivaled until it was destroyed by the Muslims. Babylon was a great center of learning and literature with the Sumerians, Sargon of Akkad, and then the Babylonians, and down through the Persian empires, culminating with Baghdad and the Arab empires. And then when again, they were broken up, they fell into civil war or were invaded by pirates and raiders or other empires. But they did not produce the same level of success that we would have seen under their imperial hegemon. Now, one thing that I would like to get at, which I think was hinted at earlier on, is that there's a cost at home of losing freedom to the empire. And to some extent, that's true, but it's not uniform. So, for example, France, Belgium, Holland, and Great Britain, during their imperial heyday, were politically more free than they are today. The current EU police state occurred only after those four nations lost their colonial empires. In fact, Britain, at the height of its imperial power, was one of the most politically free nations in the history of the world. But you could also point to the fact that the Roman Republic, due to its imperial adventures, lost its political freedom. So while I might say there's a correlation, there's definitely not a direct causation. And it seems to be more of a case-by-case basis rather than a blanket statement one could make against empires itself. And again, another thing that would be needing to be dealt with is, while it's true that one cannot say no counterfactuals, and that the Aztecs or the Vikings would never have developed without the influence of these outside forces. What I think we can say is the cost of imposing those empires on them was the cost that it took of those empires at the time was less than the total produce after they were incorporated into the system. How much wealth has Mexico produced since the Spanish conquest and then later independence? Far more than that was necessary to conquer it. How much wealth has Scandinavia produced after it wasn't actually conquered by any military force, but it was conquered through Christianity? Germany might be a better example, which is clearly obvious. The amount of force that it took Charlemagne to conquer Germany was a puny, minuscule amount compared to the vast amount of wealth produced by Germany since then. So while avoiding counterfactuals, in many cases, we can point to the fact that the subsequent productivity more than outweighed the actual cost of conquering those people in the first place. I yield the rest of the time.
Okay, great. Keith, you can go ahead and start your closing when ready.
Well, I think the first question is really, and possibly the ultimate question in a debate like this, is this. Is human civilization and flourishing advanced more by a concentration of power or by the dispersion of power? And if we look at the times in history where human civilization tended to produce the most in terms of human achievement, I think that our evidence, it points to the claim that the dispersion of power is preferable to the concentration of power. Many people recognize that really the dawn of Western civilization begins in ancient Greece. And ancient Greece flourished in part because it was a collection of largely autonomous cities, about 1,100 of them. Because of this, rulers had to provide attractive living environments to their subjects because migration was easy, exit costs were low. It wasn't a situation where a single hegemon was able to impose its own norms upon everyone. And that in turn allowed for competition between the different cities, and it allowed for the development of the concept of rights of citizens, the idea of a somewhat independent intellectual culture and things like that. Another example is the Western world during the Middle Ages. If we look at the collapse of the Western Roman Empire, yeah, for a time it did degenerate into barbarism and high levels of illiteracy and all of that in the Western world. But over time, what actually happened was that in the Western world, we saw a civilization develop where you had a situation where the kings were not able to get absolute powers and create these kind of god-king emperors like the Roman Caesars and Egyptian pharaohs and all of that. Instead, the kings had to share power with the church. They had to share power with regional monarchs. You had the rise of the independent free cities and communes. You had the guilds, and you had a lot of other institutions that facilitated the dispersion of power. And that in turn created the foundation for the development of a culture where power wasn't concentrated and where the trade routes, the merchant cities of the high Middle Ages could start to develop, and the market economy could start to develop. And then out of that, the Renaissance starts to develop, and the Protestant Reformation, and then the Scientific Revolution, and the Radical Reformation, and all of the things that came afterward that created modern European civilization. Nothing like that has happened in societies where power was concentrated indefinitely over a long period of time. One of the reasons why India traditionally has been such a backward society is because their social system is so static and rigid, and it's a system that has endured ever since the Aryan conquest 4,000 years ago. Their system is a very rigid, their traditional Indian society is a very rigid, static society with power concentrated in the elite, with Hinduism, traditional Hinduism being a very warlike religion. It's not a culture that facilitates intellectual growth. It's not a culture that facilitates individual freedom or personal mobility. And we see the longstanding consequences of that on the Indian subcontinent. If we look at the United States, we see that the United States very rapidly did develop into a world power, but at what cost? What cost did it impose on the people that it conquered? We see that the native populations were essentially wiped out. As far as Mexico, a substantial portion of the Mexican territory was seized during the Mexican War, and the Mexicans have been subjected to severe poverty throughout much of their history. We see the cost of the imperial and colonial wars that the United States has waged in other places. And we see that empires ultimately are self-defeating. They may thrive for a time, but ultimately they overextend themselves, they bankrupt themselves, they become despised and hated by their conquered peoples. They increasingly find it difficult to keep their subjects under control. The internally, empire building is not good for the host society. A society like that tends to deteriorate and become decadent over time. And that's happened to virtually every imperial empire, whether it's contemporary America, whether it was the British Empire, whether it was the Roman Empire. There are almost no exceptions to that.
Time.
Thanks.
Okay. This has been a pretty interesting debate. Would you two like to make any final one-sentence closing remarks to reflect on debate in closing?
I'll just say thanks, Keith, for coming on. It's always a pleasure.
And I'll second that on this end as well. Good discussion.
Excellent discussion.
All right, this is Todd Lewis of the Praise of Folly podcast, signing off.